Rocktown History this evening. And I want to thank everybody for coming out on such a wintry evening. We certainly appreciate that. We are so happy to welcome back the Mountain Saxhorn Band this evening. They performed for us in the fall, and it was delightful. It was fun and quite poignant at times. So I'm not sure what they planned for this evening, but we'll find out soon. I'm Penny Imison. I'm the director here for Rocktown History, and just really pleased that we're kicking off the new year with our Third Thursday Talk series. If you're unfamiliar with it, we try to have an event every month, but we take a couple months off. And so it's really the mostly Third Thursday Talk series. And I see members here and volunteers, and I always have to give a shout out to the people who really make this place run. I have the privilege of getting to stand here and talk, but really it's the wonderful people who are in this organization who make it happen. So thank you for that. If you're new and you have any questions, Andrea's here. She loves new volunteers. We love new members, so please don't hesitate. This evening, did you have any other announcements? Okay. This evening, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the Mountain Saxhorn Band, which had its beginnings in 1855. Since then, or at that time, they started regaling the citizens of the valley with the unique sound of Adolph Saxe's inventive brass instruments. So this is what the real treat is all about. These gentlemen back here will be recreating the sounds of the mid-19th century, and we are going to find ourselves in the past, which is part of our mission here, is to step back into the past and learn from history. So I could introduce everyone, because I volunteered to do that. So, I forgot to say, the musicians will be accompanied by Knappenberger with readings and interpretation. Thank you so much. So, we have here tonight the director, Dr. Kevin Haynes, Reverend Dr. Kevin Haynes, and also Loya. Our musicians are Mark Heisel, Reverend Carl Trost, Tim Turner, Luke Haynes, and E.K. Knappenberger. So, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you. We're going to start with some pieces by a German composer named Ludwig Maurer. And as Penny said, these are saxhorns. These are the original 1840s and 50s instruments. They were made primarily for military band use. The Stonewall Brigade Band, which is this organization's parent organization, actually has the entire original set of saxhorns from the 1850s that went all the way through the Civil War as the Stonewall Brigade Band. And they've kept that name ever since. Kevin, raise your hand, Kevin. Kevin is the director of that organization. So this is about as close to the sound of Civil War instrumentality as you can get. And they're rotary valve instruments. They point backwards because a group like this would have marched in front of the troops. So we're going to start with some German music, and then we're going to get into some historical interpretation. So, because we're in Rockingham County, we also are going to represent the local Civil War, pre-Civil War actually, Rockingham County Band, which was known as Charles Eshman's Cornet Band. Because they're no longer around, we have to cover down for them too. So it might have been a slightly different sound, but the music is pretty much unchanged. So tonight we're both representing Mountain Saxhorns from Staunton and the Eshman's Cornet Band from Harrisonburg. So I wanted to just tell you a little bit about that. According to John Wayland, in 1860, Charles Eshman, who died in 1901, was a teacher of brass bands and orchestras in the county. In 1867, he organized at Harrisonburg a band of 13 or 14 members, composed mainly of men of German extraction. In 1891, he was still leading a band in Harrisonburg. Mr. Eshman was a native of Germany and visited his fatherland in 1883. So that's according to Wayland, but if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that the band actually goes back before the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, Eshman kind of branches out into being a cigar and tobacconist emporium guy. So we'll get to that. We're going to play another German number real quick, so you can get the idea of what those Germans were playing and listening to. From July 20th, 1860. This was an advertisement, and I wish you could see the little pictures that were printed with it. Music, music, music. Professor Charles Eshman desires to announce to the citizens of the Valley of Virginia and contiguous counties that he is prepared to teach brass bands and orchestras or give instruction in instrumental music of any description to classes or individuals. He will furnish music arranged for bands at shallow prices and at the shortest notice. He is agent for the best manufacturers for bands, also pianos, violins, flutes, violas, and will furnish any instrument at manufacturer's prices at the shortest notice. Music for the piano and for the string instruments, and all hot and fashionable music ordered for purchase. All communication promptly attended to, addressed to him or sent to the Rockingham Register Office, Harrisonburg. He would respectfully refer to the Cornet Band of Harrisonburg or the editors of the Rockingham Register. So soon after that ad that we just heard came out, the Civil War started, and like many of the young men in Harrisonburg and some of the old men, the Germans in Charles Eschman's cornet band got swept up in war excitement. The little snippet I'm going to read you next comes from Aldine Kiefer. This comes from his March in 1890 recollections. How well I remember the fateful 19th of April, 1861. Belonging as I did to a company of Virginia State troops, I was suddenly summoned to join the 10th Regiment at Harrisonburg. How proudly we stood in our regimentals that April day, and beneath flying banners bade friends and home goodbye, and marched away to the music of Eschman's cornet band. How sweetly the strains of The Girl I Left Behind Me sounded upon our ears. How proudly Sic Semper Tyrannis floated to the breezes, and how hopes burned like stars sublime in our souls. It was to be a 3 months holiday. The sheen of bayonets, the glitter of brass epaulets, the trappings of chargers, oh, what glory! But glory is the dream of fools, as dead millions will testify to in the great hereafter. war dragged on more than the 3 months holiday that everybody thought it would turn out to be, into the winter, people started to get worried about things. This included the band. And on January 31st, they published this letter to the Rockingham Register that I'm going to read to you, in 1862, I should say. January 31st, almost 162 years ago. Rockingham Register and Advertiser. To our friends in Harrisonburg, Messieurs Editors, allow us to use your columns to apologize for disappointing our friends in not coming home as we anticipated. Our furlough was signed by Colonel Gibbons and Acting Brigadier General Colonel Hill on the 10th of January. With such promptness in signing our furlough upon their part, we presumed that Major General Kirby E. Smith would not hesitate, and were very confident that the document officially approved would be returned in time to allow us to get home by the 17th or 18th. These are the circumstances, and we had no idea in the world that our friends would be disappointed, as we certainly expected to be there on Friday or Saturday. We had no disposition to hoax anyone, especially our dear friends in Harrisonburg, and can assure them our disappointment is as great as theirs, and fully as terrible. Major General Smith is a gentleman and a man of fine heart, and would gladly send us home if he thought it expedient. The documents are yet in his possession, and as soon as he can do so, no doubt he will send us on our way rejoicing. He has the interest of the country at stake, and feels his responsibility to his country, and will send us home as soon as he deems it expedient and proper. And we can assure all he will not approve our furlough too soon to please the 10th Virginia Regiment Band. So everybody knows about Turner Ashby here, I'm imagining. That's a story that people around here kind of grow up with. I figured I would read a little bit of an account and give the band a minute to rest from a different perspective of the battle in which Turner Ashby died. This comes from the history of the 1st New Jersey Cavalry, published in 1871 by Arthur Henry R. Pine. On the morning of Wednesday, the 28th of May, the brigade turned its back upon Richmond and retraced its way to Fredericksburg. After a march of 30 miles in the exhausting summer weather, the brigade halted at a place which seemed to have been at one time the residence of a well-to-do farmer. Now the fields were untilled, the corn cribs almost empty, the men all away, and only a very bitter woman with a swarm of children remained as occupants of the house. Again, we marched quickly forward through a country of barren hillsides, seamed by ravines and covered by lonely woods, the lurking place of many a guerrilla and unlicensed plunderer. From that night we saw our supply train no more until the termination of the campaign. Far off among the mountains, with multiplied reverberations that shook the air around us, the sound of artillery struck our ears in a continuous roar of battle. For the first time we heard the sound that heralded our entrance into action. The first fight was at hand, and the men longed for it, as they never desired the second. As we ascended the hills above Mount Jackson, we saw in the distance the long line of rebel wagons, with their army drawn up to protect their passage. Between them and us rolled the swollen waters of a branch of the Shenandoah. It was now Tuesday night, and the last regular rations that had been issued on Friday morning. Once since then, a handful of crackers had been given to the men, but no other supply had been attainable. On every side, Fremont's marauding soldiery had been plundering and shooting, but our men, controlled by the habits of their discipline, had not participated in that work. About noon on Friday, the 6th of June, the army had arrived upon the hills near Harrisonburg. Broderick, with his company in the advance, dashed through the streets of the town, chasing some mounted men who had lingered there for observation. As he emerged into the open road, a body of infantry lining the stone walls on either side rose and fired into his men. Broderick drew up and coolly scanned the numbers of the enemy. Then, seeing that the force was too great for him to charge, he wheeled and retired with a deliberation that, as we afterwards learned, was the object of high admiration among the enemy. Then, in column of fours, Wyndham trotted through the town and took up a position beyond it, sending out skirmishers through the woods in front. Now we're down kind of near where the monument is on the other side of Costco, along Port Public Road. About 3 o'clock, after a colloquy with one of General Fremont's scouts, the regiment, accompanied by a battalion of the New York Mounted Rifles, advanced at a fast trot on the road to Port Republic. The regiment, which had left Fredericksburg about 800 strong, was now reduced to less than half that number. Past the remains of a burning ambulance, Wyndham carried his whole force forward with drawn sabers, all of them wild with the excitement of the race. Beneath the shadow of the trees south of Harrisonburg, a small body of rebel cavalry was drawn up across the road. "Form platoons!" shouted our colonel, catching with moistened hand a firmer grasp of his saber. While the men were still hurrying their wearied horses into the fresh formation, he gave the orders, "Gallop! Charge!" And the whole body, half arrayed, plunged forward to the attack. The head of the 1st Battalion entered the wood by the road, driving in the squadron of the enemy. The 2nd, diverging on the left, commenced to tear down the fences, while the 3rd Battalion moved still further to the left to force an entrance there. Schellmeyer led the 1st squadron until he met a heavy column of cavalry blocking up the road as far as he could see it. At that same moment, a force of infantry lying hidden in the wood poured a tremendous volley into his flank. 2 men, Charles Perry and William Tron, fell dead at that discharge, and a man named Jonathan Jones reeled, mortally wounded, from his horse. Simultaneously with this discharge, 2 regiments of rebel infantry, from behind the post and rail fence, opened a steady fire upon the remainder of the regiment. Even under these disadvantages, the high spirit of the men sustained them. The 1st squadron, the only one that could see an enemy, deliberately returned saber, and drawing their pistols, commenced to reply to the bullets that were sweeping through their ranks. And at the same moment, the heads of the other 2 battalions forced themselves into the wood, from which issued a steady stream of fire. Fortunately for our men, the weapons of the enemy threw too high, thus preventing an immediate annihilation of the command. But even when our column had entered the wood, they found the enemy perfectly protected from assault. There was nothing for it but to fall back into the field and endeavor to form line again, even beneath the fire. In a moment, there was a scene of inextricable confusion. The colonel had entered the wood, but had not come out of it. The lieutenant colonel, only saved by some of his men from being taken prisoner, had not yet regained his saddle. The senior major was enveloped in the rout of the 1st Battalion, while the standard bearer, unhorsed, had lost the colors. With a yell, the body of rebel horsemen swept down upon the disordered troopers. The mounted rifles, who had not charged, instead of covering the New Jersey, turned and left the field, and the regiment, under the terrible fire of the infantry, had no chance of meeting properly this fierce assault. The whole body broke from the field, the officers still keeping toward the enemy and endeavoring at intervals, and with some success, to check the vigor of the pursuit. You can see how this is a little different than the accounts that we hear from the southern side. Among the last to retire was Captain Thomas Haynes. In the midst of the confusion, his slender form was conspicuous as he called to the men of his company and sought to rally them around him. As he was crossing the heavy ground bordering on the stream, a squad of Virginia cavalry, led by an officer in a long gray coat, who sat erect and easily upon his bounding charger, came down upon the flank of the fugitives. A bullet from that officer's pistol penetrated the body of Captain Haynes, who dropped dying from his horse. Broderick, in whose company he had been lieutenant, was close behind him as he fell. Reining in his horse, he turned around upon the rebels and, shouting, "Stop!" fired his revolver full at their leader. The officer reeled in his saddle, and his men, catching him in their arms, hurried back from the spot. Broderick stooped over Haynes and called him by his name, but there was no answer, and there was no time to pause. Leaving the lifeless form as the enemy again pressed upon him, he sadly spurred his horse to a renewal of his flight. Thus, the 1st New Jersey Cav galloped from the field of their defeat, leaving their colonel, 3 captains, 1/12 of their troopers, and the regimental colors in the hands of the enemy. A few of the officers remained on the field and were spectators of that magnificent fight of the Pennsylvania Bucktails, in which that battalion, unsupported, checked and even drove the whole of Ashby's infantry into the woods. The little body of 120 officers and men hurled themselves against the enemy. 2 regiments that were in their front reeled and retreated before their rapid and deadly fire, Ashby himself falling in the vain attempt to rally them. Assailed and flanked by a 3rd regiment with their colonel and 25 men wounded, and no support coming to them from the infantry of Fremont, their little band retired, the colonel refusing to be carried from the field where his men had killed and wounded many more than their own number of the enemy. With this glorious contest ended the fighting for the day. In the Harrisonburg churchyard, their lamented comrade, Captain Haynes, was interred on the following day, while the cannonade at Cross Keys thundered out a requiem, and no eye was tearless as the earth was thrown upon his coffin. So that's a very different account of the Battle of Chestnut Ridge, or the Battle of Harrisonburg. And that started what's known as the occupation of Harrisonburg, the first occupation of Harrisonburg. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of newspapers that survive from that specific period, but there are accounts of the occupation of Harrisonburg in northern papers. I have one here for you. This is from the Boston Post, May 1st, 1862. From Banks's column, a jolly time at Harrisonburg, Virginia. April 29th. At noon today, a national salute was fired from an eminence near the town. The regimental bands assembled in the courthouse square and played Hail Columbia. The soldiers gave 9 cheers when the band followed with the Red, White, and Blue, Dixie, and the Star-Spangled Banner. After a recess, the bands consolidated and marched through the streets, much to the disgust of several prominent inhabitants. The day was pleasant, and the bright new uniforms presented a striking contrast to the somber hues of the former occupants of the town. 3,000 rebels under General Edward Johnson, formerly of the Federal Army, are posted a few miles from Staunton in a position easily to escape in case of General Milroy's approach. So we're going to play a couple of those tunes for you, and you can imagine Yankee Band marching around Court Square, and the wives of the rebel soldiers looking on in disgust. This is probably the closest that you'll get to hearing what it actually sounds like. So, we do have some newspapers after the first occupation of Harrisonburg. This was the first thing that was published, I'm going to read to you, after the Yankees left. This is from the Rockingham Register, July 4th, 1862. The Yankees in the Valley. It gives us no ordinary pleasure to state, as we do upon good authority, that the Yankees, to use one of their choice and elegant forms of expression, are skedaddling rapidly out of this beautiful valley, which they have been blasting and desolating with their presence. Reason for their sudden retirement? Not that they didn't want to remain in such rich pastures, but their grand army of invasion at Richmond has been well walloped. God be thanked that we are to be rid of them. It matters but little to us what hath driven them away. Our people are so heartily sick and tired of seeing villainous and thieving Yankees that it will hardly be safe for vendors of wooden net mics to come this way for the next 50 years. Well, it wasn't 50 years before the Yankees came back. It was about 2. And I'm going to just read another small snippet. There's plenty of material on this era of Valley history, the 1864 burning, it's called, in the museum down here. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend that. But I am just going to read a little bit of a follow-up from the New Jersey Cav, since we started with them. September 25th, 1864, Sunday, an extremely warm day. With the morning light, we saw nothing of the enemy, who had entirely withdrawn from our front. We marched by the right of battalion to the front in 10 columns on the Turnpike Road, that's Route 11, and reached Harrisonburg in the middle of the afternoon. We had cavalry skirmishers ahead and a line of infantry, which passed through the town. That's a lot more than they started with the first time, from which a few rebel cavalry hastily fled. Several caisson wagons, with the spokes of the wheels cut with an axe, stood in the main street. We finally, after some marchings around, came into camp on a hill northeast of the town, and on the easterly side of the Turnpike Road. Harrisonburg had not been in possession of the Union troops since June 1862, when Jackson made his raid, and was then driven back by Fremont. In that pursuit, the 1st New Jersey Cav Regiment took an active part, being in the lead most of the time. In a charge made 2 miles beyond the town, the regiment met with loss. That's what we just read about. Its colonel, the 3 captains, and a large number of men were captured. Captain Thomas R. Haynes was killed. He was buried by a farmer on the field, but the grave was opened by his own men, and the body brought back to Harrisonburg and buried in the cemetery, while the Battle of Cross Keys was being fought. At the earliest moment after the town was in our possession, the graveyard was sought. A citizen remarked, "Are you looking for Captain Haynes's grave?" and pointed it out. They all seemed to know of the Union officer who was killed at the same time as Turner Ashby. The grave had been unmolested in that quiet spot among the tombs of their own townsmen, and every reference made to the dead officer was respectful and kind. The grave was marked by a wide headboard, Captain Thomas R. Haynes, Company M, 1st New Jersey Cav, June 6, 1862. after the war, Eshman did not give up his band. And it's really interesting to read about. He kept going for another 30 years, him personally, having led his band through the war. Like I said, he became a tobacconist. So he was selling music and cheap music and instruments and cigars and snuff and everything else. One of the interesting things that I found that I'm going to read you before we close, this comes from the Rockingham Register, June 25th, 1867. This gives you a little bit of an idea of how society reorganized itself after the war. The veterans coming together with the widows, and ultimately they formed what we know as the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And this was a really big deal to those people. They had to learn how to live with the newly freed slaves. They had to learn how to subjugate their political ambitions to political occupation for about 7 years. It was a very hard time. Music played a very key role in keeping those people together, giving them hope and helping them cope with the tremendous amount of loss that they experienced. So I'm just going to read this to you. At a meeting of the Ladies Memorial Association of Rockingham County, held on Monday evening, the following was adopted as the program of arrangements for Tuesday next, the day fixed upon a floral offering at the graves of our Confederate soldiers in Woodbine Cemetery. Band of music, orator and clergy, children of soldiers with bouquets, president and officers of the association, ladies with wreaths, soldiers of the Confederate Army, citizens. The procession will march to the Presbyterian Church, singing by the choirs, prayer, oration, hymn. The processions will reform and march to the cemetery, prayer. The decoration will then commence. The bells will begin tolling when the procession leaves the church. Places of business are requested to be closed. Ministers of all denominations are requested to participate. List of marshals, our band. Not the least, by any means, of the institutions of our active town is Eshman's Cornet Band of Music. It is composed of 12 members and is made up, 2/3 of it, of our German fellow citizens. The leader, Professor Eshman, being one of the finest musicians in the state. The Register Office, we are pleased to state, contributes largely through our foreman, who is a very small man with a very large heart, to the sweet sounds sent out to the world by this band. As a matter of course, the capabilities of our band of music are eagerly sought after by those who appreciate the advantages of superior music at public gatherings, such as processions of masons, oddfellows, etc., etc. Where these gentlemen have no opportunity of blowing their own horns, it is entirely unnecessary for us to blow for them. The services of the band were to requisition at the laying of the cornerstone of the Episcopal Church in Harrisonburg yesterday, Wednesday, and today, Thursday. They will attend and give interest to the closing exercise of Professor McMullen's school at Stanardsville, Greene County, returning in time to play for the procession to the Confederate soldiers' graves in our cemetery on Tuesday. As they bought and paid for their instruments with their own money, they always charge, as they should, for their services, except in cases such as the last. That was called Who Will Care for Mother Now? This next one is Annie of the Vale. That was the Fairy Waltz. These are actual period pieces that would have been played both before and after the Civil War. Next is the My Native Land Quickstep, and then I think that closes us. Are there any questions before we end, or?
I have just one question. I noticed the design from that time period, all the brass bells point behind rather than forward, like currently. Why was that?
That's a good question. The reason these instruments were designed to point backwards is because they were military band instruments, and this group would have marched in front of the column of soldiers, and that way the soldiers could hear better. Good question.
Are the instruments all tuned to the same key, or are they various keys?
They're not all tuned to the same key. Kevin and Tim have slightly different tunings. I believe they're in E flat. Tim, by the way, is transposing as he's reading his music. So he's got to learn. We've been playing together now about, a year, a little over a year. And Tim's had to learn how to transpose on the fly. Kevin, you're playing an E flat. This would have been the equivalent of a French horn. And most French horns now are in F, but this is in E flat. You're both playing B flats, aren't you?
I'm E flat.
Oh, okay. Jacob, hold yours up. This is an E flat soprano. Is that a B flat in your other hand?
Yeah.
You can kind of see the difference. It's not a big difference, but the size difference there is enough to change. What is that? A concert fifth? So Jacob's been transposing both from B flat and E flat. The original Saxhorn Band had drums. We may or may not ever get drums. In a space like this, you probably don't want them. But it also had a clarinet accompaniment, and that's Luke Haynes over here. Say hi, Luke. Wave your hand. Luke and Jacob are students at Eastern Mennonite, and they're music majors. So, and Carl, raise your hand. This is Commander Retired Reverend Carl Trost. Mark Heisel, and Tim Turner. That's us. All right, we're going to close unless they're
Evan, this is probably sort of a silly question in a way, but during the war, when they were going, how did they transport the instruments? Was each individual in charge of his and maintenance, or did they have like a common wagon or something?
I believe that there was a wagon.
The bandwagon.
It was not. The wagon wasn't always there. Let's put it that way. During battles, the band would have been stretcher bearers. They were expected to do all sorts of dirty work. When I was in the Army not that long ago, it was still the same. The band's got all of the dirty work to do. That will probably never change. I think they had to cook and clean. And I think all of them, except for one or two in Eshman's band, made it out alive. I believe in the Stonewall Brigade Band, a couple died as well. But it wasn't nearly as bad as the rest of the troops in terms of casualties. Of course, they were still subject to disease and the elements as well. Ron?
The article from the Boston newspaper that you read from about the occupation in Harrisonburg, the music that they played. So they played Dixie?
They did. That's a great catch. I'm glad you caught that, Ron. They played Dixie when they occupied Harrisonburg. And we've talked about as a band some of these themes of Southern music. Some of the music that was in the band's repertoire had some kind of racist overtones and things to it. We talk about that quite a bit, actually. Do we want to play this stuff? How do we want to interpret it? How do you do so in a manner that's both historical and respectful? In this case, it worked out really well because we were representing a Union military band playing Dixie. So if people want to complain that that's a Southern song, then they're just wrong. It was, history will bear this out, that Union bands played that song as well. Why? I'm not entirely sure, but I'm glad you got that.
Was Dixie, was it held in high regard? I mean, was it like the anthem of the Confederate Army at the time, or maybe that's come along later? Or
I think it was.
It was.
It was. If I'm remembering properly, it wasn't that old of a song during the war. And it definitely was considered the Confederate anthem, along with the Virginia Marseillaise and Bonnie Blue Flag. If we have time at the end, maybe we can close with one of those.
Not Dixie, Eric, but so much of the music, when was it composed? Because when I'm listening to you guys, with the exception of maybe some of the military things, it's just like going to Austria and Germany.
It is. It's fascinating, isn't it? The European sound, right? A lot of these waltzes and quick steps, they have a very European character to them. The ones that we opened with that I mentioned were Ludwig Marr pieces. Those were, he was a German. Yes, it almost has a kind of a polka feel or an oompa to it. It's fascinating music. The more we play it, the more it gets stuck in my head, and I come home singing it for days at a time. But yeah. Was there another question? Okay, well, we're going to do My Native Land quick step, and then maybe we can just do an encore of Bonnie Blue Flag. Or let's try that one. Yeah. Surprise, guys.
illuminating. And thank you to everybody for coming out. Please drive safely and stay warm. And we hope to see you back next month. Peggy Shiflett, who is an author who has written many books about Appalachian life, right, Appalachian, will be coming, and because she has a new book out, so that's quite exciting. So hope to see you on the third Thursday in February with better weather.
I